Welcome back, Ultima Weapons. It's the Night Sky Prince again, with Final Fantasy XV selling 8.1 million units. Final Fantasy has proven that it's still the absolute dominating force in the world of JRPGs. Despite sales being incredibly strong for the game, its reception has been quite mixed. While the characters have been largely well received, the game's method of storytelling and many aspects of its gameplay have been met with a large degree of criticism. Of course, Final Fantasy XV isn't the first Final Fantasy game to be this divisive. Final Fantasy X-2 is where opinions on the franchise's direction first became questionable. Final Fantasy XII was well received by critics, but there's still a large number of fans who thought it was absolutely the wrong direction to go in. But it was Final Fantasy XIII that ended up being the breaking point for many longtime fans, ultimately disenfranchising many people. It was at that point many people questioned Square Enix's competency and their ability to make a quality Final Fantasy game like they used to. With Square Enix likely planning the future of the franchise at this moment, we're left to wonder if the captain of our ship really knows where it's going. We're left to wonder, will Final Fantasy XVI be the one to take Final Fantasy back to its golden era, the one that many fans claim ended after Final Fantasy X? Final Fantasy XVI is still a long ways off. In the meantime, what you would call the next mainline Final Fantasy game is Final Fantasy VII Remake. Square Enix can no longer afford to create Final Fantasy games in which so many people walk away disappointed. Yes, fans are pretty forgiving and will buy almost anything with the words Final Fantasy on it, but that doesn't mean that fans always will. And by no means does Square ever start one of these projects saying, let's make a game that only half the fanbase will enjoy, although it may seem like they do that at times. So what's the foundation of creating a legendary Final Fantasy XVI? Above all else, when creating any new game, the choice in game engine can be one of the most crucial decisions any developer makes. Choosing the wrong technology or struggling to develop your own can not only delay your game by several years, it can also result in a poorer quality game due to struggles with the engine. I can't think of a more painfully obvious example of this than Final Fantasy XV's Leviathan fight. The Leviathan fight was said to be entirely reworked because Luminous Engine would end up crashing whenever the fight ran on consoles. Having to design the same fight twice due to struggles with your engine is a complete waste of time. The weeks in which they spent doing this, they could have easily spent time creating better side quests or better main story content. Final Fantasy XIII was in development for around 3 years, though according to the game's director, Motomu Toriyama, actually creating the game itself only took about 1 year. They spent 2 years waiting on a workable game engine, Crystal Tools, before even being able to touch the game. They ended up rushing to complete Crystal Tools, and to do so, developed it very specifically to Final Fantasy XIII's needs. The result was the other two games that were slated to use this engine, Final Fantasy XIV 1.0 and Final Fantasy Versus 13, would be completely unable to use it without massive reworking. For Final Fantasy XIV 1.0, this caused the game to be catastrophically broken at launch. For Final Fantasy Versus 13, it resulted in the game facing numerous technical challenges. Crystal Tools could easily produce some of the best looking games of last generation. In fact, looking at the PC version of Final Fantasy 13, the graphics can still be pretty breathtaking. But to achieve this, Crystal Tools only rendered very small areas at once. Final Fantasy Versus 13, a game intended to be open world, would require several massive reworks to get the game running. After spending 2 years after the release of Final Fantasy XIII trying to get this game to work, and it simply wasn't working out. It was 2012. The PlayStation 3's days were numbered at this point, and they knew PlayStation 4 would be launching at the end of next year. Tatsuya Nomura, Versus and 15's director at the time, said the lifespan of current generation consoles was starting to pose a problem to us. If we were a year late, other companies will have more time to research the next generation. Releasing the game against their products on the older generation could cause us to have inferior looking products when people inevitably compared us. And so it was decided to move the game over to PlayStation 4, where they could start over with a new game engine, codenamed Ebony, which would eventually become Luminous Studio Engine, where they would repeat almost the exact same mistakes all over again, rushing an engine together in just 3 years. The result was a game that was riddled with many technical issues throughout its development, and it's probably the largest reason why the game's story is missing so many details. Square Enix, at the same time, was initially developing Kingdom Hearts 3 with the Luminous engine as well, but it proved to be so unstable at the time they eventually ditched it for Unreal Engine 4. Final Fantasy XVI cannot go down the same road. These proprietary engines may be something that the company is prideful love, but it has proven multiple times to be disastrous. Final Fantasy XVI must use Unreal Engine 4 or something comparable, and it should release in a timely manner. Final Fantasy games have such long development times now, in part due to poor technology choices. Looking at games like Dragon Quest XI, it just goes to show what the company can create when they're less focused on creating proprietary technology and more focused on creating engaging content. And with engaging content, I can't think of anything else that makes a player more engaged with a JRPG than its story. Final Fantasy was the leading pioneer in this aspect. Although there have been plenty of great JRPG stories over the years, Final Fantasy has always been aided by top quality graphics. There has been a lot of discussion on if Square Enix should dial those graphics back to be able to more quickly produce content and make a game that feels more complete. Many fans look at something like Persona 5, which is incredibly fleshed out, so much so that it takes you a lifetime to finish, especially if you have a full-time job. While the game's graphics aren't technically impressive, the game is one of the most gorgeous and stylish games you could ever set your eyes on. Is this the direction that Final Fantasy XVI should set its sails to? In my view, not at all. I think it's very easy to sit here in the present time and say games didn't always need impressive graphics to tell epic stories or to manifest some sense of immersion in us, but then we cite examples like Final Fantasy VI, which by far was the best looking game on the Super Nintendo. The world map which appeared in 3D and the beautiful sprites and the impressive music. These things were all powerful tools that help draw you in. When you play Final Fantasy VII now, it looks incredibly primitive, but in 1997, that game looked state of the art. The use of pre-rendered backgrounds and high-quality CG movies pull gamers further into the story like they've never been before. The idea that graphics are in opposition with storytelling is complete nonsense. It's not as though they hire so many texture artists that they don't have budget left over to hire writers. As of 2018, Square Enix has over 4,300 employees. This doesn't even include their outsourced work or studios that they contract to work on games for them, such as Platinum Games, who developed Nier Automata, or Koei Tecmo's Team Ninja, who worked on Dissidia Final Fantasy NT. They also outsource much of their work to studios in countries like Vietnam, Malaysia, and India. And if they need more people, they hire them, such as the case with Final Fantasy VII Remake. So when it comes down to it, putting story first means, above all else, creating something that feels complete. Final Fantasy XVI must not feel like it's missing any details, and it must not require any external media. And by external media, I am specifically talking about movies. While many people found Kingsglaive to be an enjoyable movie, there was still a clear problem that was created here. Without the movie, Final Fantasy XV didn't make much sense, and it was missing details. And for many people, that's probably how they ended up playing the game. Although, because the team who worked on the movie and the game were two separate teams, much of what happened in the game and the movie aren't in perfect alignment. This becomes very apparent when you realize how many continuity errors there are. Final Fantasy XVI should be one game that is played from start to finish, where the entirety of the game can be played without disconnects. This also includes DLC. You should not have to hunt down or purchase additional plot points. DLC is a great place for side stories that aren't within the scope of the main game's plot structure. If Square Enix did want to integrate DLC into Final Fantasy XVI, create interesting side characters and stories that don't leave the main game a complete mess. Episode Aranea, rest in peace, was a great idea for a piece of side content, as her backstory wasn't necessary in the scope of the main story for Final Fantasy XV. That said, something like Episode Ignis, which contained vital parts of the story and set the context for the events after, having that be DLC is completely outrageous. But then there's the scope of the game's story and world. Final Fantasy VII Remake is said to be a multi-game epic, simply because it would be impossible for them to remake the entire scope of the original game in a modern game. Many people are still outraged at this idea, but a large number of people in the fanbase, after thinking more deeply behind the reasons for this, are more understanding and more accepting of it. Does anyone else remember this golden nugget about how Final Fantasy XIII can feature towns because, quote, HD towns are too hard? Let me ask you something. How many total towns does Final Fantasy XV have? I'm not talking about a gas station asset that they copied and pasted. I'm talking about an actual town. How many are there? Well, there's only 2 of them. Lestallum and Altissia. The number of town areas in Final Fantasy VII is somewhere around 15. Final Fantasy XV takes place on 1 continent, whereas Final Fantasy VII has 3 continents and multiple surrounding islands. Final Fantasy XV, when it was first announced, was also planned to be a multi-game epic, just like Final Fantasy VII Remake is now, with the game's original director Tetsuya Nomura saying, quote, "In the trailer, there was a line that read, 'A World of the Versus epic,' which suggests it will be part of an epic," while While Final Fantasy XV will have one climax as a story, we plan to continue it further. The point I'm trying to make here is that Square Enix has considered making the next mainline Final Fantasy a multi-part epic for quite a long time. Instead of having to wait a half-decade between the mainline games, you'd instead have a trilogy of games that made up one whole Final Fantasy. Depending on how this goes with Final Fantasy VII Remake, Final Fantasy XVI might be the first game to properly implement this going forward. I can't sit here and tell you one way or another on how I feel about it, as Final Fantasy VII Remake is still ongoing. We don't know how this exactly will turn out. But I can say that if this is what it takes to get Final Fantasy games on the same scale that they used to be when games didn't require such massive amounts of resources and time to create, then I'm open-minded to it at the very least. Though on the idea of a new structure to deliver Final Fantasy XVI is likely to feature an action combat system. Series producer Yoshinori Kitase said in an interview with Edamame Arcade Channel that currently there are no plans to introduce a modern version of the active time battle system. This might strike some of you as odd. Kitase was the director of Final Fantasy VI, VII, and VIII. This battle system is something that, in his hands, seemed to foster critical acclaim. In many ways, for directing those games, he's the reason for the so-called golden era. In either case, we could cry over spilled milk here. Personally, I don't mind Final Fantasy XVI using action combat, as the essence of Final Fantasy to me has always been storytelling, world, and characters. However, what I do mind is combat being fundamentally broken, unsatisfying, or dare I invoke the ungodly criticism that has plagued 12, 13, and 15, that the game, quote, plays itself. And while I don't fully agree that these games play themselves, they are a little bit too automated. If the entire point of active combat is to make the player feel more involved with battles, then it's utterly ridiculous to have combat that feels so passive. It seems as though they've tried to make Final Fantasy combat faster and more dynamic, and yet they sacrifice much of what would have made this style of combat appealing in the first place. Though what I believe represents another half of the fanbase is one who would love the series to pay homage to its roots, much in the way that Final Fantasy IX did. Final Fantasy IX looked at the direction of Final Fantasy VII and VIII, as they drifted off into a direction that was different than the series was initially. For that reason, Final Fantasy IX is an absolute fan favorite for many. Even playing Dragon Quest XI, I couldn't help but feel how incredible that old school JRPG feeling still was. Turn-based battles, towns, even text boxes. As a pure JRPG as you can possibly make, this is precisely why it resonated so well with fans. Many people here in the West making Dragon Quest XI their first Dragon Quest game, and absolutely falling in love with it right away. I couldn't help but think while playing it, what if they made a Final Fantasy game like this? This is the safest way that Square could ever play it, and it also just might be the most effective way too. Though with all these expectations and desires of Final Fantasy XVI, the current problem is there isn't anyone to make the next Final Fantasy game. Business Division 1, which contains most of the experienced staff working on Final Fantasy games. In essence, the veteran Final Fantasy team is currently working on Final Fantasy VII Remake, which as a multi-game series is going to span quite a number of years. Business Division 2, who developed Final Fantasy XV, has transferred most of its staff over and has become its own separate studio. That separate studio is now known as Luminous Productions, who is said to be working on AAA non-Final Fantasy games. Business Division 3, also known as Square Enix's Osaka team, is working on Kingdom Hearts 3. After they finish, I can't imagine them working on Final Fantasy XVI, as this would postpone the development of Kingdom Hearts 4, in the same way Versus 13 postponed Kingdom Hearts 3. The rest of the business divisions handle entirely different matters, such as mobile games, MMOs, and new IPs. I could not imagine Square letting an external studio handle their company's biggest and most valuable IP. A spin-off game, sure, they've done that plenty times before, but a mainline Final Fantasy? No way. This could mean two potential scenarios. The first is that Square Enix won't begin Final Fantasy XVI until after the completion of Final Fantasy VII Remake, and that means all of its volumes. This could help a lot, as remaking Final Fantasy VII could help them rekindle the magic, so to speak. Though they may do this anyways just to have all the marketing focused on Final Fantasy VII Remake. The second option is that Square Enix pieces together staff members from various teams. Alongside several new hires, they create a team that is capable of working on Final Fantasy XVI. In terms of directors, many people want Hiroyuki Ito, who directed Final Fantasy IX and XII, to return, though he hasn't directed a game since 2006. Motomu Toriyama, the director director of Final Fantasy X-2 and Final Fantasy XIII Trilogy, currently maintains Mobius Final Fantasy, although most people just don't want him back as he really isn't that good. Legendary game director Yoshinori Kitase, director of Final Fantasy VI, VII, VIII, and X, has been promoted to a producer and has no plans of stepping down. Of course, 15's director Hajime Tabata is no longer working for the company. Tetsuya Nomura is already so divided between the Final Fantasy VII Remake series and whatever the Kingdom Hearts franchise will be doing after 3 that he's just too busy. Naoki Yoshida, director of Final Fantasy XIV, could definitely do it, and he said that he's even open-minded to doing it, but he also insisted that he wouldn't step down from Final Fantasy XIV unless the company absolutely needed him to direct the next mainline. Yoko Taro could definitely direct it, but with the huge success of Nier Automata, I'm sure that both Square and Taro himself would rather him be focused on making that franchise a major player, rather than just pulling him off to work on Final Fantasy XVI. Final Fantasy has different meanings to all of us, and that's part of the beauty of the franchise. That's also what makes making a good Final Fantasy game so hard. The definition of a good Final Fantasy is defined so drastically different from person to person. Ultimately, Final Fantasy XVI is a long ways off, but my hope is that we can have a Final Fantasy game that brings us back into that so-called golden era and make us feel the glory days once more. So Ultima Weapons, I want to know, what do you most want to see out of Final Fantasy XVI? Is it a return to form for the franchise, a game that tells a great and compelling story, or just a great set of characters that you can really identify with? Subscribe, click the bell icon, and let your voice be heard in the comments below. And if you really love Final Fantasy, I mean really love Final Fantasy, be sure to check out the Patreon for the Night Sky Prince. I work day in and day out to make the best and most active Final Fantasy and JRPG channel on YouTube. If you truly value my videos and want me to be able to keep doing this, this is the opportunity. Your awesome support is what makes this happen. Just make sure it's not Marlene's schooling money. Link in the description below.